I run a tech company. I can sometimes figure out PCs. It's like a little here or there. Well, anyway, so I just had the pleasure of meeting Corey today, and he's the CEO and founder of Catalia, did I say it properly? Health. And Dr. Kidd's been working in healthcare technology for nearly 2 decades. The focus of his work's been applying innovative technologies towards solving large-scale healthcare challenges. His previous company, Intuitive Automata, created interactive coaches for weight loss. And prior to this, Dr. Kidd received his MS and PhD at MIT in the Media Lab in human-robot interaction. While there, he conducted studies that showed the psychological and clinical advantages of using a physical robot over screen-based interactions. His current company and what they do with the elderly population is truly amazing, giving them an interactive, personalized partner as a robot in their houses. So I'm excited that I got to meet him today and look forward to hearing all about what you're chatting with us about.
Thank you. All right, so I'm going to switch directions a little bit here and start to talk first more broadly about artificial intelligence. Before I jump into that, talk a little bit more about my background so you know where I'm coming from. You just heard a bit of it. I have been building healthcare technology largely for challenges around aging for about 22 or 23 years now. So I've been building this kind of stuff for a long time. Academically, my work was in computer science and artificial intelligence. Originally, I did an undergraduate degree at Georgia Tech over in Atlanta back in the 90s. I was faculty there for a little while, helped build and run a research lab focused on what we now call aging in place. So looking at all different sorts of interfaces for an older population to help people live at home longer. I left there in 2001. That's when I went to MIT. So I did my master's and PhD at MIT in the Media Lab. My work there was largely in artificial intelligence and psychology. And I'm going to talk in a few minutes about how those come together. And psychology is really one of the original places that artificial intelligence comes out of in terms of disciplines. The last 3 years at MIT, I split between there and Boston University Medical Center. I do not have an MD, but I did spend 3 years in a diabetes and weight management clinic seeing patients. So working very closely with the doctor who ran that clinic, Dr. Caroline Apovian, and had a lot of hands-on experience. And so the culmination of that work I'll talk about in a few minutes as one of the drivers of work that's happened now across a number of academic and commercial settings in terms of using artificial intelligence and robotics in healthcare. So what I want to talk about today is a set of things around where we can focus right now when it comes to new technology. And I'm going to look around to see if there's a clicker or if it might have left the stage. Anyone see a clicker that... Okay, I'll stand right here for the moment. I want to talk about the... Oh, there it is down front. We've got it. Found it. Thank you. And so I'm going to talk then about the impacts of this kind of technology on patients. I want to talk specifically about using AI and robotics in practice. We're at a point in time where this is still pretty new and cutting edge, but it's also still very real. And so I'm going to go through some examples of both research and commercial applications of this that you can take a look at in practice today. And then I want to talk a little bit about the data. Right? A lot of what we're doing in technology comes down to the kind of data that we can get, the quality of that data, how well we can use it in different applications. So we'll spend a few minutes talking about what that really means. Before I get into this, though, I want to get a sense of who's here. How many people in this room think they could define artificial intelligence for someone else? Not a single hand? Someone here has to. All right, I have a feeling a lot of people think they could, but think I'm going to call on them and so aren't going to raise their hand. Don't worry, I wasn't going to. Okay, so that gives me kind of a baseline of where we are at least, and so I will start with some basic definitions of AI in a minute. Before we get into that, disclosures. My current job, as you heard in the introduction, I'm the CEO, founder, and major shareholder of Catalia Health. We're a chronic disease care management company. I'll mention briefly some of the stuff that we're doing, but since this is a CME talk, I'm not going to spend much time at all on what we're doing as a company. I'm also involved in some other healthcare technology companies and funds. So I do keep pretty busy and wanted to kind of highlight those going into this. But where I want to start now is really the motivation for the work that I've been doing for nearly 25 years now. So this I usually talk about as my very uplifting slide. So, I'll give this talk a lot to audiences who maybe aren't nearly as familiar with healthcare as those of you in this room. And so this little word map, these 10 things up here, are what killed us a century ago, or a little over. This is actually data from the year 1900, and the relative size here is the number of people that these things killed. So obviously, TB, pneumonia, flu, gastrointestinal infections were the big killers. And the thing about this that I think about here is a lot of these things, if this is what you are about to die from, unfortunately, you may not be diagnosed with, or if you are, you've got maybe a few hours or a few days. Often this is what went on a death certificate posthumously. But now let's jump ahead to today. And if we look at data from 2010 is the last year that we have good data nationwide, and we look at the top 10 things, a lot of those things off the 1900 list are gone. They're no longer in the top 10 killers. Many of them that are there shrink pretty drastically. Some of the things that were on there but pretty small are obviously getting more prominent. And then we need to fill out the top 10 list here to look at the top 10 things now. And then if we rebalance for the number of people that succumb to these things today, we see two things obviously dominating this slide now and literally don't even fit if we use the same sizing that we did from 1900. But really the interesting thing I think about what we're looking at here is everything that's now being highlighted in red are things that we think of as chronic conditions today, right? So we go from a century ago, things that, again, even if you found out that you had it, you were probably going to die from, to things today that, again, are chronic and ongoing, things that we're going to live with, not for hours, not for weeks or months, but for years or decades. And that's, of course, a result of the amazing advances that we've made in medicine over that time. We've figured out a lot of very basic things around, cleanliness and hygiene, but also incredible advances in procedures and devices and in pharmaceuticals that have really changed the way that we think about, dealing with disease today. And along the way, we've increased lifespan over the last century by more than 30 years. So the biggest advance ever in the history of humankind. And obviously that's an enormous change, right? And what that means is a lot of what we're dealing with patients today, of course, there's still a lot that happens in the acute setting, but so much of chronic care is now happening outside of the clinic. It's not in the hospital. It's not in your office. It's in our everyday lives. We know we've got about half of adults in the U.S. and most developed nations dealing with at least one chronic disease. And of course, as we look, as we look at an older demographic, that number goes up pretty significantly. A lot of my work over the last couple of decades has been with adults ages 65 and plus, and depending on which part of that demographic we're talking about, we may be talking about 70, 80, 90% of the population dealing with a chronic condition every day. And so that's really the fundamental challenge that a lot of us are thinking about when it comes to why are we introducing technology into healthcare at all. Now, I'm going to talk about a range of different applications here around AI in just a minute, but one of the areas where we're starting to see a lot of work in the last few years is around helping to manage these conditions. And of course, one of the drivers for this is the second point up here, really the economics around it. The way that we deliver care today, when it is entirely human-powered, we've shown already all too effectively that this is not sustainable. At the current costs, we can't interact with patients nearly as often as we would like to. We don't get to see patients frequently. We don't get to see all the patients that we would like to get to. It's always an enormous challenge. But the opportunity here now is not only as we can start to scale care across frequency with a patient and across the number of patients we can interact with, at the same time, we can really start to personalize it to those individuals. And we've had the phrase personalized medicine for quite a while now, and it's meant different things at different times, but now we can really start to think about that in all different aspects of care. I mean, the last talk we heard a lot about this, about how you start tailoring certain information to certain patients. And we're seeing the pace of that pick up very rapidly now. And I'm going to talk a bit about that in a few minutes. But, I introduced the topic a little while ago around data, right? And having the data that we need to start to be able to personalize care to individuals, to start to understand what's going on with either a person or a group of patients. And if we start to look at the data that we have available today, we start to think about a lot of different types of data. We've heard a lot over the last few years about genomics. It was not that long ago that we were able to first sequence a genome. Right now, that is relatively inexpensive to do versus what it cost us even a decade ago. But more importantly, we start to understand specific portions of that genome that we might want to sequence very inexpensively for a particular patient, either as part of a diagnosis or part of a treatment plan. So this is one area that's advanced a lot over the last 15 to 20 years, and we're still continuing to see a lot more work, and that will continue to evolve over the next few years, 5 or 10 years. We'll continue to learn more and more there as well. Another piece of it is around the behavioral and psychological aspects of patients. Traditionally, this was something that was really hard to get data about. If we think about a lot of our psychological data, a lot of it comes from various studies in a university setting where your data is all on some group of participating undergrads as part of credit in their psychology courses. Right now, we're able to get a lot of other data about behaviorally and psychologically what's going on with different patients. We heard some about that in the last talk, and we're seeing a lot of examples in the last 5 or 10 years about how we're starting to get additional data around what's going on, what are people's lives actually like. When we think about a patient on some treatment for some disease, what is their actual lived experience day to day? We still have a long ways to go in this one, but we're starting to get a lot more insight there than we ever had before. One of the places that's gotten much easier over the last few years is around activity, physical activity. Devices like the Fitbit that's on my wrist. I'm sure at least one or two of you here are wearing the new Apple Watch, right? And you can get an EKG reading off of that. There are many devices that have gone from things that we would have thought of using, probably a big bulky device in a clinical setting a decade ago to things that are consumer grade today. And by consumer grade, I think there are actually two interesting trends there. One is around price point. Just being able to buy a device for a few $100s that might have been a $10,000 or $20,000 device a decade ago opens up the possibilities in terms of just the number of patients we can use this on, but also the frequency which we can collect data. Right, if we can give a device to a patient, wear this for the next 48 hours or the next month, or things like the Fitbit and other activity tracking devices that many of us have on our persons at all time. How many people in here have at least one of these kind of tracking devices on right now? We got about a quarter of the room. So, these things have really caught on, and I bet most of you didn't own one of these even 5 years ago. How many of you in here had something at least 5 years ago that tracked activity? 3. All right, not bad. The concept of these is not new. I had my first internet-connected pedometer 19 years ago this year. It was really bulky. There was a base station I had to plug it into, and as soon as you put it in there, you heard the beeping of a modem as it literally dialed up to some server to upload the data. Right? So the concept has been around for a while. We've been able to do this, but now it's pervasive. For $100, you can go out and get an internet-connected activity tracker. And then the last piece about the consumerization of those is the simplicity of use. Right? If we think about these devices, the medical device versions of these that we would use in a clinical setting, it's going to take someone who is trained to set that up. Right? First, just to get it to operate it at all. And second, to get the data that you need to out of it. Today, we can literally send one of these to a patient in the mail, expect them to open up and be using it in a couple of minutes, right? So we've made it very easy. And that's a trend over a lot of different types of technology that I think is really powerful when we start to introduce it into healthcare. And a lot of these pieces come together then in understanding the daily health, right? So I started talking a moment ago about, our actual lived lives of patients. When we think right now about where we've come from and expectations around patients once we've diagnosed them and given them a treatment, we typically think in one of a couple ways. Here's kind of the ideal. Here's what you're going to go do, right? And we assume that they're going to go do it. Or the reality that, a large percentage of patients don't, but we don't really know why in a particular example. And those are the questions that we're starting to be able to answer with a lot of the new technology that we're able to use today. And this, overall, in terms of data collection, I'll talk about some other kinds of data in a few minutes, is something that continues to rapidly increase. Things like the Apple Watch that was just released is going to mean there are a lot more people getting some basic signals, right, that may or may not be valuable depending on how we use them, but the data collection and the capabilities around getting that data is increasing very quickly. So let me turn for a minute and talk really broadly about artificial intelligence. So the concept of AI actually goes back centuries when we think about what the original definition is. And the original definition here is really around trying to understand how we as people think. What are human thought processes? And how do we leverage those using some kind of technology? Today, we typically think about that as being, a computer, a laptop, smart things we carry in our pockets everywhere, the devices that we're wearing on us. But there have been analog versions of artificial intelligence going back centuries. There's some classic examples from the 18th century of building things that could play chess or other games were some of the early examples. But kind of the modern era of artificial intelligence really got going in the 1950s. And the term artificial intelligence itself was coined by a couple of researchers just 52 years ago, 1956. Marvin Minsky and John McCarthy proposed this summer program where they were going to solve computer vision and computer hearing and speech output and thinking processes. And 52 years later, we still have a long ways to go, but they were very ambitious then. But again, that core concept was just thinking about, okay, as humans, when we think about a problem, what are our thought processes? How do we go about it? How do we then understand those or break those down in some way and then turn that into some kind of technology that can help to solve a similar set of problems? So at a very high level, the concept of AI is very simple, but it's gone in many different directions since then. And this is, I want to introduce some of the history of AI because it'll help to make sense of a lot of what we're seeing today. So over the last 50 years, we've seen a lot of different approaches to how we're going to go about artificial intelligence. There's the concept of what I was just talking about, the original definition of we figure out how people think, right? And this is part of why I say AI originally was really closely related to the field of psychology, because that, of course, is a lot about figuring out how we think about something. And then turn that into a set of algorithms or a machine that can solve similar problems. Another branch of AI then has really been around, okay, I don't care how people think. I want to solve this set of problems. Let's figure out a number of techniques to go about that. And there have been a lot of approaches within that area as well. And then there's a third area that's really kind of somewhere in between those two, if you will. So maybe inspired by human ways of thinking, but we don't necessarily try to copy the human way. Let's use maybe some of that process to create something that a machine can do. Now, I'm not going to go into depth on any of these right now, except for I want to talk for a minute about machine learning or deep learning. So the concept behind this is essentially we take some set of data and we figure out what that data means. Now, that's vastly oversimplified. I'm going to get into more specifics in just a second. But that is the whole concept behind machine learning. And what it's really doing is taking a bunch of pieces of data, a large data set, and training some algorithm on what to look for in that data to give you some outcome. So the biggest example of this in medicine has been around radiology and reading images. So taking, say, a large set of mammogram images and training an algorithm on which of these show cancer at which stage and which do not. All right, so this is an example where there's been a lot of work over the last decade or so in medicine of applying machine learning. And so this is an example of that second type of AI that I was just talking about, where we don't care at all how a human might do this. All we want to do is give a machine, a set of algorithms, enough examples so that it gets the right answer almost every time. Ideally every time, but we have a ways to go before we get there. Now, as I said, this part of AI has been around for a good half a century or so, but traditionally it was really hard to do, mostly for two reasons. One is getting access to data sets is really tough, right? Figuring out, going back to the last slide that I was talking about here, most of this data that I was just talking about, these examples are from the last 5 years. Some of the older ones go back a decade. So if we start talking about AI a couple decades ago, machine learning was originally a bit of work done on the 1950s. It was revived again in the 1980s, but it was tough to get those data sets, particularly a good labeled data set where we know what quote unquote truth is, what the right outcome is that we're trying to teach the machine. But the other challenge is simply processing power, right? If we think about reading through all of this data, having some algorithm do something on it, if we go back even 15 to 20 years, it would have taken some of the biggest supercomputers in the world to do this kind of work. And those were the places where this kind of work is going on. If we fast forward to today, these devices that we're all carrying in our pocket have more power than big supercomputer did a couple decades ago. So the fact that we now have the processing power and the data sets means that machine learning is a particular part of AI that we're hearing a lot about today. There have been a lot of advances over the last 10 to 20, or really the last 5 to 10 years in this specific area. And so I want to spend just a minute pointing that out because a lot of when you hear the phrase artificial intelligence or the letters AI today, what people are really referring to is specifically machine learning. So I want to give you a sense of what that is. And there are a great set of applications for that. Again, when you have a data set and you can train a set of algorithms to do something with that. But there are a lot of other applications of artificial intelligence, and that's why I started with the more broad, thinking about human reasoning, human thought processes to apply to technology in some way. So there are a lot of other places where AI is useful. And to point out a couple of things where we see and hear a lot about this today, in terms of prominence, we've all heard about Watson. This is a division of IBM that's been around for a number of years now. They've also acquired quite a few other companies to put under the Watson umbrella. They're working on many different problems, right? We've probably heard about their work in oncology if we want to talk about kind of clinical applications and trying to recommend particular treatments to a clinician. And at the other extreme, we've probably seen Watson on Jeopardy, right? Trying to take in broadly a large set of data and use that to answer some questions. And then if we talk about places where we've seen some of the strongest results, it is really in using machine learning or deep learning for image analysis. And the last thing I say on this slide I think is important is that this is not typically about replacing people. That's not where we're seeing the most success, and I'll talk about that in just a second again. But it's really about as an adjunct to clinicians who are doing this work today, right? It's another tool in our toolbox to be able to solve problems that we face every day or to be able to solve those faster. And so there are a number of different approaches that are really applicable when we start to think about AI in medicine. One is, again, around using these large data sets. And what's happening there is we're learning some feature in that data. To go back to the mammography example I just gave, if you are a trained radiologist and you are looking at these images, you have a theoretical foundation for what you're looking for and how you go about looking at these images and what you're trying to find. If you are an AI algorithm doing that, there is no theoretical basis of that at all. That algorithm has simply been fed probably tens of thousands of images and shown that this is an example where there is something that you should highlight, and this is an example where there is not. So these training sets are how this is gone about. A very different way of going about AI is really around structuring knowledge in some way. And this is another thread of artificial intelligence that has had continuous work over the last 4 or 5 decades. And this is really going back to, again, that original definition where we think about, how does a person think through this problem? So in medicine, there are lots of examples going back 30 or so years in what we call expert systems. And so kind of a classic example in medicine is using AI for diagnostics. And what we're doing is we're sitting down with clinicians and textbooks and figuring out, okay, what is that process we should be going through? What are the questions that we need to answer for this algorithm to come out with the right answer? And again, this is similar to medical training, right? When you're going through and learning about what you need to do a diagnosis, it's the same kind of thing we're trying to teach a computer. So that, so number 1 and 2, you might be using in sort of complementary ways, but they're very different ways of going about structuring this. And one of the things to point out about this that I think is really relevant today, and we're starting to see a lot of discussion about when it comes to AI in medicine, is number 1 is essentially a black box. Right? We don't know what it's quote unquote thinking, right? What process it's going through. We just know that we've taught it well enough that 99.7% of the time it's going to come out with the right outcome. But we can't go and say, okay, what did you see in this particular image that said to flag this image, or what did you not see in this one that says this is okay, right? It is totally a black box. Whereas when we build systems around structuring the knowledge, we can actually output essentially a quote-unquote thought process, right? So the steps that this algorithm went through to come up with the answer that is appropriate. And now, we're seeing both of these used in medicine today. Again, number 1 is where we're seeing a lot publicly right now, just because it's been the area with the most advances in the last few years for the reasons I was talking about. But broadly, the trend that we're starting to see is when we see clinicians and the technology partnering together. And in some sense, thinking about AI as a new or different technology, I don't necessarily think is the right way to go about it, right? It definitely is new and different, but very basic technology that we use every day, from stethoscopes or more complex devices in the clinic, up through any pharmaceuticals that we use to medical devices. All of these are technologies that we've brought into our practice. And thinking about AI in the same way is really the right way to go about it. There are those like you who are in this room because you want to be kind of on the cutting edge and understand what's coming, but this is going to impact all of medicine over the next few years. We're going to start to see it in very specific areas, but the application is going to become more and more broad. And so I want to spend a minute going through just a range of things, particularly on the pharma side where we're seeing AI, just to give you a sense of a lot of different types of things that are going on right now. I've spent my last 5 years doing a lot of applications in the pharma space, so this is an example that I'm clear with, that I've spent a lot of time looking at. And so on the pharma side, we can think about it from the very beginning. On the drug discovery side, these are examples of a few companies that are doing things, and these are 2 out of many. There's a lot of things happening in the AI and drug discovery space, either trying to look at kind of a more fundamental understanding of a disease process, or trying to do a better job of matching, chemistry and biology to specific targets in a disease. A lot of different approaches happening there. And we see every big pharma company is engaging with some of these startups or acquiring them. Most of the smaller pharma companies are doing the same kind of thing. It's really about how do we optimize that process? How do we spend less money up front getting to a promising target that we can go into trials with? And then, of course, the next step is clinical trials, and we're seeing a lot of interesting things happening there as well, from the design of trials, trying to design them better so we can do things faster and or with fewer patients, optimizing the data collection and analysis, to a lot of work just being done trying to figure out how we find patients who would be appropriate to enroll in a trial. All of these are very challenging, complex, big problems that contribute to the expense in clinical trials, and so there's a lot of interesting work going on there. Once drugs are on the market, we're seeing a number of systems using AI to improve the prescribing experience, either for suggesting, for a particular diagnosis, here are a set of drugs that you might want to look at, to watching for drug interactions, other things along those lines. And a lot of these systems are fitting into the existing EHRs, is where those are starting to be used, as opposed to kind of a standalone thing. A lot of things on the benefit management side, right? Simply figuring out the whole process of, once we write a script, to between there and getting that to the patient, how can we make that whole process much more efficient? How can we automate some of that to ease the challenges either for the clinician or the patient there? And then the last piece is really around the patient care management. Now that patient has that script, how do we keep them essentially on therapy and out of the clinic or hospital? How do we follow up with that patient from day to day? And I'll come back and talk about some more of that in a second, but some of the specific challenges there are really around once that patient leaves the clinic, there's often a gap in who is going to provide that follow-up care. It may be, here, call us if you have this issue. We know most of our patients aren't going to do that unless it's really acute and they need to come back in and see us for some reason. And so there are very few touch points with most patients dealing with a chronic condition once they've left our office or the hospital. And then getting that patient to engage in their care is often very challenging. We heard a lot about that in the last talk. That's been an area of my research over the last 15 to 20 years, is really looking at what those challenges are, looking at what those barriers to adherence are. Some of that is directly related to the disease or the side effects of the treatment. A lot of that has to do with the psychosocial issues that our patients are facing. We're looking at patients dealing with chronic conditions. We've got a much higher rate of things like stress, anxiety, depression than the rest of the population. And this is a place where this kind of technology can really start to make a difference. And the last piece here touches again on that data question, right? If we're not interacting with the patients in any frequent way, we don't have any data to give us any insight as to what might be going on with that particular individual so that we can do follow-up as appropriate. And so this is where AI, and now the second topic of this, robotics, starts to come into play. And so we can start to use those algorithms based on the theoretical foundation of what, as clinicians, we want to do with patients. We can start to use the data to tailor these to specific patients. We can start to use this then to understand better what's going on with patients on a day-to-day basis after they've left our care so that we can then time follow-up for patients who need it when they need it. And ultimately, this is about improving adherence, which is leading to better outcomes. So that's really the foundation here. So I've spent a while talking about AI. I want to switch topics and talk about robotics for a second. So if we think about robots in healthcare, there are probably one of two things that come to mind first. This may be one of them. How many of you have seen this movie? I have at least a few in here. Okay, the rest of you need to see this, definitely. So this is a movie called Big Hero 6. Came out about 3.5 to 4 years ago now. This is the healthcare robot in that movie. So it's a big blow-up thing. The particular robot, obviously this is an animated movie, as you can see from this. But the interesting thing about this movie is again, it's this kind of futuristic setting where this is a healthcare robot that can do absolutely anything that, a doctor today would love to be able to do for a patient. But the movie was based on the work of two real people, both of whom I happen to have connections with. One of them was one of my AI professors 20 years ago when I was a student doing my undergrad degree. And then for those of you who've seen the movie, there's the evil character in there. He was based on one of my grad school professors, who I will point out was not evil at all, but it was kind of funny when they made him that way. And so, this is actually a really interesting film when it comes to thinking about AI in healthcare, right? Sci-fi, whether it be animated or, live action, has driven a lot of technology over the last few decades. I think this is a classic example. And so I said, if you think about, robotics in healthcare, you might think about one of two things. For some people, it's this. For other people, it's this, right? The Da Vinci surgical robot. Not new. Been in OR for almost a couple decades now. And so this is a case where less on the AI, more on kind of the pure robotic side of where we're using, physical manipulation to be able to do things in a surgical setting that might have been challenging to do in any other way. So I'm not going to talk about this in depth, but I wanted to point this one out as an example that the concept of robotics in healthcare is not new at all. Another one that many of you may have seen are something like this. There are a number of these kinds of products on the market, and this is essentially trying to solve some of the logistics challenges in a hospital setting, right? So in this case, this is a pharmaceutical delivery robot. Some of you may work in settings, I've seen these in a few places now, where there's actually a robot elevator in a hospital, which tells us where the future is going here. So we're using these now in hospital settings to move drugs, move supplies, other materials around. So really helping to let the people who might be tasked with doing that on top of their patient care jobs unload some of the kind of menial tasks to a robot and to technology. And then one more example here is this robot, who some of you may know. So this is Pero, the robotic seal. Comes from a company out of Japan. This has been around for about 15 years now. This is a pretty simple robot. I mean, you can see it's just this plush seal. Its head can move around. It can kind of squeak. And it's supposed to orient towards people that it's interacting with. And the concept behind this is to be able to interact with an older person to help improve their quality of life. So again, a whole range of things that we've seen out on the market over the last 10 to 20 years. But I want to talk about kind of some of the fundamental aspects of interacting with this kind of technology that's really going to change where we're going over the next 5 to 10 years. We're going to go from things that are not autonomous at all, right? This is entirely driven by a surgeon typically sitting across the same room, to these kinds of autonomous devices that are delivering supplies, to things that are more interactive. And I want to talk about where this interactivity becomes important. So when I mentioned at the beginning kind of my trajectory of starting to work broadly on these big challenges around aging in place, and then I focused in more and more on the challenges of chronic care, and really looking at the set of problems I talked about 20 minutes or so ago in how we help follow up with patients on a day-to-day basis. And this was about 17 years ago now. Started thinking that this kind of interactive robot or social robot, and this concept is pretty new. We're starting to see these products coming onto the market now. 17 years ago was very early, and I thought they held promise for solving some of these problems. And so I set out and ran a whole series of studies, and I want to talk about some of the findings from those, because this is really going to illustrate, I think, where this kind of technology is going to go over the next 5 to 10 years. Now, of course, these studies involved technology. There were no robots available. I had to build and program them when I was at MIT. But these studies were really all about psychology. And so we used a variety of different robots. You can see this one's very simple. It's literally a set of plastic eyes that could move around and could blink. To a slightly more complex robot. We put that on a little arm, and the only point there was to be able to change the distance between the robot and the person that may be sitting across the table from it, and there's a little bit of a face around it. To starting to get to slightly more complex robots like Mel the penguin. I'll tell you a specific story about some of the work there. To very complex robots. This is a robot called Leonardo. This was built between our lab and a Hollywood studio that's built a lot of other robots, like the Aflac ducks, the dinosaurs from Jurassic Park movies. They built Terminator. So this robot had about 70 motors in it, and roughly half of those, about 35, were in its face, making its face nearly as expressive as yours or mine. But what's interesting is that the findings that we have in terms of interaction are very similar if we talk about these simple eyes all the way up through that complex robot Leonardo. And what I'll talk about for a second is, again, this is really about the psychology of interaction that we were looking at. And when I started doing this, there were really two sets of things that we were trying to compare and contrast with. On one side, interacting with something on a screen. Whether that be, a small screen that today we all carry with us, to, a larger screen, to a television. We know a lot about that world, right? The field of human-computer interaction has been around for about 60 or 70 years now. So we understand a lot about what's going on there and the unique aspects of interacting with technology like that. And on the other side, we were comparing to interacting with people. And of course, the field of psychology has been around for much longer, and so we have a lot to compare against there. And the assumption going into this was that interacting with a robot was going to be somewhere in between. Now, the easiest way to describe what we found is explained by why we're all here in this room together today. How many people here actually live in Las Vegas? One. Okay, that's one more than I was expecting. Right, you come to a venue like this, everyone's traveled a ways, right? Why are we all here? You could have watched these talks. I could have stayed. I live in San Francisco now, stayed there and, sat behind my webcam, given a talk. It could have gone up online. You could have watched it from the comfort of your office or your home, right? But we're here in person, right? So much of the practice of medicine is in person. We're sitting right there with our patients. Some of that's for the physical reasons, right? The physical exam. But also we know that being face-to-face makes a difference, right? We get intuitively that there's a difference. Psychologically, we know what those differences are. When we're face-to-face with someone, we're more engaged in the conversation. We create a stronger relationship. That relationship is going to last for longer, and a number of other things as well. Now, what this whole series of studies showed is that those differences actually carry over into the world of technology. So we could interact with, patients or people using technology through a screen-based interface, but when we actually put a device like one of those, or this one that we give our patients today, in front of someone, and it literally looks them in the eye while it's talking to them, the difference is that we get those psychological effects of face-to-face interaction. Now, if we're talking about one or two interactions, with a patient, maybe on intake or something like that, we can measure those differences, but it's not really important in terms of outcome. When we care about establishing a long-term relationship with a patient and getting them to engage over time, this kind of interface really does make a difference. And there are a number of factors that go into this. I ended up spending about a half a dozen years doing study after study trying to understand what was going on here and why we had these outcomes. And I'll tell you one story using this robot on the right. So believe it or not, that was built by a former Disney engineer, kind of a hobby project for him when he joined Mitsubishi Electric. I spent about a year consulting for Mitsubishi Electric about 15 years ago now. And when I came in, they had this very interesting AI system around language. And it had been used in a lot of on-screen interfaces. And the whole point of this was to be able to craft a dialogue for someone to explain a complex topic. So again, this was about 15 years ago. One of the systems they had built was, this was the early days of a DVR. A TiVo had just come out, right? And these were really complicated, a whole menu on the screen. No one had dealt with that. So how do you build technology to walk someone through this, someone who's new to something like this? Another example is you walk into an office building or a building like this. Somewhere, hidden from us, there's a really complex HVAC control system. How do you walk a naive user through that and get them to use it? So this language model they built was actually really good at this, creating a dialogue for a person, walking them through some complex technology, answering questions they might have. And so some of them were really interested in, okay, what happens if we put this on a robot? And I helped them design some studies that let us do this to try to understand what that interaction might be like. So this penguin here is called Mel, was his name. Mel is a pretty simple robot. There's a couple flippers there that can move. His beak can move in time with what he's saying. The eyes don't move. That's some sewn-on doll eyes with some little glasses there. Now, if you remember, cutting-edge technology from 15 years ago, that round blue thing behind there was, one of the tiniest webcams at the time, right? This separate thing that you could put on top of your computer monitor back then. And we were using that to figure out where the person was so that Mel could orient his head towards the person he was talking to. And then, again, that language model that he had was pretty complex. We could use something called didactic gestures, right? So when I point at Mel, I look over or I point. Those are didactic gestures that we use naturally in conversation. And the setup here was, you kind of see this picture down on the bottom next to Mel. One of the other projects there was this kind of smart glassware thing where there's a set of mugs next to that. And when the mug got almost empty, it would automatically alert the bartender, right? So some very important technology that was being developed there. And Mel was giving a demo of that. So I actually got the person who came in to pour water back and forth and show them how it worked. All right. And now we brought in 40 people. And they each spent about 5 minutes with Mel, right, going through this conversation, getting this glassware stuff explained to them, this back and forth. Okay, and this was a randomized trial, so we had people split into two conditions. Half of them got the demo as I just described for you, right? Mel would use these gestures. As they moved over in front of the glassware, Mel would look over at them, right, maintain eye contact, if you will. For the other half of the people who were randomly sorted in this other condition, we made one simple change, which was as they started interacting with Mel, we flipped off all the motors. Okay? Same conversation, but Mel sat there like this the whole time, right? Never moving in any way whatsoever. Rich conversation, explained everything that was going on. Now, After each of these 40 people finished their conversation with Mel, again, about 5 minutes or so each, took them out of the room, and we asked them a whole series of questions, right? We were looking at, some basic things about how much did you like this? Would you come back and, do something else with it? We were looking at a lot of different psychological aspects of, what they thought of this experience and, looking at different pieces of their experiences related to this. But the first question that we asked everyone was, you just spent 5 minutes with a robot. While it was talking to you, did it move? All 40 people said yes. Right? This thing was smart enough. It seemed like that, it was a robot. It was talking to me. It had this complex conversation. Well, yeah, it must have moved, right? So they kind of filled in their minds that, yeah, this thing was moving all around and talking to them. All right, so no one picked up on the fact that this robot was not moving. But on pretty much every one of those other measures that I just talked about, there was a difference. Right, so when Mel was not moving and doing essentially the socially appropriate stuff of making eye contact while he was talking to someone, or gesturing at things during conversation, when the robot wasn't doing that, people did not have as good an experience. And so that's one specific example, but there are now scores of studies looking at different aspects of this social interaction and showing how they really do make a difference in terms of perceived experience. And so this is where I'm really tying these two threads together in terms of both the AI and the robotics. There are a lot of interesting things that we can do in terms of tailoring content to a particular patient. But if we're just delivering it through a device like this, it's hard to create that engagement. It's hard to get the social aspect of that really does make a difference over time in terms of outcomes. And again, it doesn't matter if it's one of those simple robots or something more complex like this or something in the middle like what we give our patients today, you still see those outcomes. So I want to present just briefly an introduction to some work that we're doing. I'm not going to talk about the business of it, but I want to talk just a second about some of what we're doing with patients. So let me see if I can get this video to play here. All right. That last little bit, where he puts a scarf on is based on what we actually see our patients doing. The first randomized controlled trial using this technology was almost a dozen years ago. We gave patients something like this for a couple months. And 12 years ago, the technology was a bit bigger and bulkier. These white robots, I hand-built all of them. Go back in to pick them up from patients' homes. About half of them were dressed up. Hats, scarves. One of them had a red feather boa around its neck. In that study, every single patient had named their robot unprompted. Right? So this really starts to show, I'm talking about a minute ago the psychology, but the anecdotes around what patients do is very interesting. That particular study, a lot of our work now is with an older population. That particular study, the average age was early 40s. Right? And so what that meant is those were people like you and I. They were spending a few minutes a day with us. They were out at work. They were at school. Right? They weren't an older person that's home alone and this is their only companion. And I'll be happy to talk about some of the work that we're doing commercially after this outside. I want to focus on more the overall aspects of AI and robotics in here. And I'm going to open up to questions in just a couple of minutes. But I want to finish with the last couple things here. So one is, where is AI not useful? Right? I spent the last 45 minutes talking about the promise of it, the advances, and some of the things that we're seeing. Some of the things that are definitely limiting factors right now come down to, number one, we talked about this a little while ago, but I think this is really important when we think about using AI in medicine, which is when we're using machine learning or deep learning, the algorithms cannot explain why they got to that answer. Right? In some places that may be okay, as long as we're fitting it into a framework where we understand well enough how we're using that and why we're using it. In other places, we might need an answer to that. This concept of figuring out how to use these algorithms and get some explanation around it is a hot area of research right now, but we're still a ways from being able to have answers to that. So I don't think that this will always be the case for any of these, actually, but these are still things that are quite a ways in the future. A lot of what I've talked about to date is around what things are reality now or in the immediate future. These are definitely further in the future. Another thing that we're starting to see a lot of work around are the biases in certain models. Right? Depending on the training set, we might train in human biases into these models. And we're starting to become more and more aware of that, but there's still a long ways to go there. And if we think about some of the challenges that we've seen related to clinical trials in medicine, where it turns out that we've focused in on a particular demographic and those outcomes might not be as appropriate for a different demographic, we're going to have the same challenges when we leverage AI algorithms there. And it's something for us to be aware of and to think about and to ask questions about of the technology that we might want to employ in practice. And the last one is really something that humans are naturally good at, the empathy and the emotional piece of it. Now, obviously, that's something that has been a part of my work for the last couple of decades. But broadly speaking, when we're thinking about AI, that is not something that AI can do today. Right? And so these are all things that we think about, in terms of the limitations and what we may or may not be able to do with this kind of technology, at least over the next few years. And so, wrapping up, the last two slides are really just around, where, a little more concretely on where are we today, right? So AI is very real, yet at the same time, there's a lot of hype. And sometimes this can be very mixed. We've given a lot of examples here around technology that, I had a slide with about 10 or 12 different companies that were doing work in AI. And, if you go out to do your homework on these, maybe you're looking for some solution. I think a lot of these companies are really good at saying exactly what they do and don't do. A lot of the press coverage of them might overhype it quite a bit, right? So when you're reading about this stuff, try to find sources that are going to be more accurate about what this technology can and cannot do. Because I think one of the problems that we've seen with the concept of AI in the last few years is a lot of the writing about it is a bit overhyped. And as I've said a few times here, this is going to have an impact on your practice in the next few years. Right? I don't care what part of medicine you're in. This is a fundamental type of technology that we're going to see used more and more. It may be more or less hidden. It might be a feature that's embedded in something in your EHR that is kind of helping out or making a tip here or there. It might be something much more explicit, like something like this, in a patient's home that's getting data back to you. I'm happy to answer questions. I'm going to open it up after a couple more points to questions and happy to follow up afterwards as well. But just kind of the last thing here is you don't have to be a computer scientist or an AI expert to leverage this today. There are, if you want to be kind of on the more technical side, most of the tools I talked about throughout this are available in some way if you actually want to implement something. This is a trend that is pretty new, but being able to grab some of these things and use them yourself is pretty straightforward if you have any kind of aptitude or interest in technology. There are a lot of products, and again, I gave examples of about 10 companies out of literally hundreds out there, from small to really big companies that are leveraging this kind of thing. And depending on the organization that you're in, there may be people there who are experts in some or all of this kind of technology that can bring it into your practice. So I'm going to wrap it up there. I think we have a few minutes left for questions. I would be happy to answer those now, and then additionally, I'll stick around for a few minutes afterwards. Right in the back. Yeah, so the question, if you couldn't hear, is around data privacy and what do we need to do about that. So I'll talk about two things that I'm saying briefly. One is, if you're a company like ours, or pretty much, any of the other ones that I talked about, kind of a foundational principle is everything you build is going to be HIPAA and high-tech compliant. All right, so we go to a lot of effort to make sure that all of our patients' data is protected. From a legal perspective, we have a BAA in place with all of our customers and partners to be able to share data. We put a lot of work into the data and security and privacy. As we've seen many examples of, that's never perfect, right? So we need to think about both on kind of an individual technology basis, what's happening, as well as a healthcare system or society basis on how we address this. And I think that there's a lot of work that's happening in this space, and there's a long ways to go that we have to figure out. One of the interesting trends that we're seeing in kind of the machine learning in healthcare space is, if we look at traditionally what's been done, and you're building a machine learning algorithm, then you want to get a whole bunch of data in to do something, whether it's training or the analysis or whatever it might be. One of the things I'm starting to see is kind of flipping that and doing it in reverse, right? Where if I'm a researcher or a company building an algorithm, and you're a clinician that has a bunch of patient data, instead of saying, hey, you give me all your data, I'm going to say, look, here's the algorithm. It goes into your computing environment. You get some outcomes. Maybe I get to see what those outcomes are, but I never have to touch the patient data. And so I think that there are some interesting things around how that data is stored, where it's stored, who has access to it, that is, in my opinion, very much moving in the right direction to support privacy. Right in front.
Hi. I was wondering how the chronic AI intervention you mentioned.
So the question, if you couldn't hear it in the back, was which chronic disease states have the most opportunity for innovation, with this kind of technology? I would honestly have a hard time picking one. Even in our company, we're operating across a lot of different conditions. I think that there are some fundamental things that we can do with patients, regardless of which condition. Obviously, the specifics that you're doing are going to vary a lot from condition to condition, but I think there's really opportunity across the board. One way you can look at it is, what are the big chronic conditions? Heart failure, COPD, diabetes that affect a large patient population, but there are other ways to think about it as well. So I think there's huge opportunity there. In front.
Great presentation.
Certainly. Yeah. So the question was, what are the biggest breakthroughs that we've seen in AI and robotics? I'd say in AI, if we want to talk about what's going on in machine learning, the uses of machine learning in radiology, I think is pretty incredible, right? The outcomes that we're seeing in terms of these algorithms getting better than the best humans is something that would have been hard to imagine 15 or 20 years ago. And so I think we're going to see more and more of that. And similar to that, anywhere where you can have good labeled data sets to learn from, we're going to see that working well. I think that, I'm a bit biased, but the work that we're doing at the intersection of psychology and AI, we're starting to see really positive outcomes over the last decade or so in terms of patients. On the robotics side, I would say to date, I gave most of the examples in a couple slides, right? There haven't been a lot there, but there's a lot of work going on that's, just at the early commercial stages that we'll hear a lot more about over the next few years. Yeah. So the question, learning algorithms and potential hazards, I think that is actually a very broad set of questions, right? It depends on which set of learning algorithms we're talking about, what the data inputs are, and where those are being used. One thing I have not addressed today is FDA is actually doing a lot of work around this, right? And so the first AI algorithms or applications have been approved by FDA. And so, we're not completely there yet in terms of our regulatory framework about how we look at this kind of stuff and get it out there, but we are vastly further along than we were even 2 years ago. And so thinking about what those challenges are in that kind of framework is somewhere we've made a lot of advances. But, we still have a ways to go in understanding exactly what those challenges might be. Yeah, so the question for those of you who couldn't hear it was, really, is the kind of work that we're doing in robotics like this also been done on screen-based interfaces? And the short answer is yes, there's a lot of work that's been done there. And which one you want to use is going to depend on what your application is. So if it's kind of a one-off or a very irregular interaction with the patient, the screen-based interface I think is appropriate. You don't have to ship something like this to a patient, right? So logistically, it's a lot easier to get it out. But from the work I was talking about, if you care about the duration of engagement with that patient, right? If we're talking about something that's going to last over months or years, then this kind of interface really makes a difference in terms of outcomes. Time for maybe one more question if there are any.
Could you comment on some ways towards the supercomputer?
Sure.
We can benefit from it in ways that help you?
Yeah. So the question is on kind of the race around supercomputers and what's being developed there. That's a never-ending race, right? Everyone's always trying to do better and more processing power. And the place where that's had the biggest impact on what we've been talking about over the last hour is really in those machine learning and deep learning algorithms, right? The fact that you can actually take these large data sets and do something with them in a matter of minutes or hours that 20 years ago would have taken months or literally years if it was even possible at all. And so I think it's just going to let us continue to build bigger and better models that take into account more information, right? If we go back to what we were talking about at the beginning around these data sets that are becoming available, we're rapidly increasing the amount of data that we can gather about patients in the real world. What are today's supercomputers are going to be tomorrow's devices that fit in our pockets, right? And so the ability to start to process all of that data is something that's really helping us do.
Who's winning the race so far?
That constantly goes back and forth. So, all right. Well, with that, I want to thank everyone for participating in this. A lot of great questions. I'll stick around for a few more minutes if there are any follow-up questions. One last one right here on my way out. Yeah, so the question is, do we see a future where robots will be able to reflect empathy? And the answer is yes. I think that I don't think it'll ever be the same as a human, but there's a lot that we've really drawn on in terms of psychology and understanding how those interactions take place and what we can do to start to leverage a lot of that in robotics and other technology. So, thank you.